1,000 years ago, the world was quieter. There were no cars, no electricity, no glowing cities stretching across the night. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, darkness truly arrived. People lived by candlelight, by fire, by the rhythm of nature itself. Most would never travel far from where they were born. A nearby village could feel as distant as another world. Life was slower, but harder. Every winter brought fear. Every illness could become a death sentence. And survival depended on things we rarely think about today. Food, warmth, water, safety. In medieval Europe, narrow streets filled with smoke and mud, people worked from sunrise to sunset just to stay alive. Kings ruled kingdoms, lords controlled the land, and ordinary people lived lives shaped by struggle, faith, and uncertainty. But despite the hardships, this world was alive. Markets echoed with voices. Castles towered over villages. And in the darkness of the Middle Ages, entire civilizations continued to rise, fight, and disappear. Tonight, we travel back 1,000 years to discover what life was really like in a world completely different from our own. If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys through history, welcome to History Before Us. And now, let us step into the past. To understand what life was really like 1,000 years ago, we have to begin far away from kings, wars, and castles. Because for most people, history did not happen in palaces. It happened in fields. It happened beside small wooden homes, beside muddy roads, beside rivers where people washed clothes, carried water, and listened for the sound of distant church bells. Around the year 1000, much of Europe was rural. The great cities that we imagine today were either small, crowded, or still developing. Most people lived in villages, surrounded by farmland, forests, animals, and open sky. Their world was not measured by clocks. It was measured by light. Morning began when the sun rose. Work ended when darkness made it difficult to continue. The seasons controlled everything. Spring meant planting. Summer meant labor. Autumn meant harvest. Winter meant caution, because if the harvest had been poor, the cold months could become a long test of endurance. For ordinary people, life was not about choice in the modern sense. It was about necessity. A child born into a farming family usually became part of that farming life. A person born under a lord's land often stayed connected to that land for most of their existence. Travel was rare for many, not because people had no curiosity, but because movement was difficult, expensive, and sometimes dangerous. The village was the center of life. It was where people worked, prayed, married, argued, raised children, exchanged news, and measured the passing years. Everyone knew everyone. Privacy was limited. Reputation mattered. A person's actions were remembered, repeated, and discussed. In a world without newspapers, phones, or fast messages, people carried information with their voices. News arrived slowly. A traveller passing through might bring stories of a distant conflict. A merchant might speak of prices in another town. A monk might share news from a monastery. But for many villagers, the wider world felt distant and uncertain. The home itself was simple. Many houses were built from wood, clay, straw, and whatever materials were available nearby. They were not designed for comfort in the way we understand it today. They were built to protect life from weather, wind, and cold. Inside, the air was often filled with the smell of smoke from the hearth. The fire was central to the home. It gave warmth. It cooked food. It provided light. It was the heart of daily survival. Furniture was basic. A table, a bench, a chest, sleeping spaces made from straw, cloth, or simple bedding. In poorer homes, people often slept close together, not only because space was limited, but because warmth mattered. Animals were often nearby. Chickens, pigs, goats, or cattle could be part of the household environment, or kept very close to it. The boundary between human life and animal life was much thinner than it is today. Food was plain, seasonal, and deeply connected to class. For most ordinary people, bread was essential. Not the soft white bread many know today, but darker, heavier bread made from grains such as rye, barley, oats, or mixed cereals depending on region and wealth. Pottage was common, a thick stew made with grains, vegetables, beans, herbs, and whatever could be added. It could change from season to season. Sometimes it was filling, sometimes it was thin. Meat existed, but it was not an everyday food for many peasants. It could appear during special occasions, after slaughtering an animal, or when circumstances allowed. Fish was important in many Christian regions, especially on days when religious rules shaped what people could eat. There was no supermarket, no refrigerator, no guarantee that the same food would be available tomorrow. Preserving food was a skill of survival. Salting, drying, smoking, fermenting. These methods helped people make food last beyond the moment of harvest. Water was necessary, but it could not always be trusted. People drank from wells, streams, and rivers. Ale or beer, often much weaker than modern versions, was common in many places because it was part of daily life and safer in certain conditions. The taste of life was simple: earthy bread, warm stew, smoke, herbs, sour flavors, salt when it was available, fresh fruit when the season allowed. And for the poor, the constant awareness that food was never guaranteed forever. Work began early. For farmers, the body was the main tool. Hands, shoulders, backs, feet, everything was used. Fields had to be prepared, seeds planted, animals watched, wood gathered, fences repaired, grain cut, hay stored, water carried. There were no machines to remove the burden. A task that takes minutes today could take hours then. Grinding grain, baking bread, washing clothes, making cloth, repairing tools, collecting firewood. These were not side tasks. They were life itself. Women worked constantly. Their labor often held the household together. They prepared food, cared for children, managed animals, worked in fields, spun thread, made or repaired clothing, and handled endless domestic responsibilities. Their work was not always recorded in history, but without it, daily life could not function. Children also worked. Childhood existed, but it was different from the modern idea of long protected youth. Children learned by watching and doing. They helped with animals, carried water, gathered small materials, watched younger siblings, and slowly absorbed the skills needed for adulthood. By the time someone was still young, they might already understand tasks that modern adults would find difficult. But life was not only hardship. This is important. It is easy to imagine the past as nothing but suffering, but people 1,000 years ago still laughed, celebrated, loved, hoped, and found meaning. They gathered during festivals, they told stories, they sang, they marked religious days with rituals, food, and community. The church was one of the most powerful forces in daily life. In many parts of Europe, Christianity shaped the calendar, the rhythm of the week, the meaning of life, and the understanding of death. Church bells could mark time. Priests guided spiritual life. Saints' days, fasting periods, holy days, and festivals gave structure to the year. For ordinary people, the church was not just a place of worship. It was a place of gathering, a place where people heard news, received instruction, and felt connected to something larger than the village itself. Faith offered explanation in a world filled with uncertainty. When storms destroyed crops, when sickness spread, when a child did not survive, when war approached, people searched for meaning. Religion gave them language for fear, hope, guilt, and comfort. Education was limited. Most ordinary people could not read or write. Knowledge was passed through memory, tradition, craft, and speech. Reading belonged mainly to clergy, monks, some nobles, and certain trained people. Books were rare and valuable. Before printing presses transformed Europe centuries later, books were copied by hand. A single manuscript could require enormous labor. This made written knowledge precious, slow to produce, and often controlled by religious institutions. For a farmer in a small village, the world was known through experience more than text. The smell of rain, the behavior of animals, the condition of soil, the timing of frost, the stories of elders. Knowledge lived in practice, and that knowledge mattered deeply. A person who understood when to plant, how to store grain, how to treat simple wounds, how to build a roof, how to care for animals, or how to survive a hard winter possessed knowledge that could mean the difference between stability and disaster. Above the village stood the social order. Medieval society was often imagined as divided into those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. In reality, it was more complex, but the basic idea reveals something important. People were born into a hierarchy that shaped almost everything. Nobles controlled land. Knights served through warfare and loyalty. Clergy guided spiritual life. Peasants worked the land and formed the largest part of society. A lord's manor was a local centre of power. Peasants might owe labour, rent, crops, or services. In return, they might receive protection or the right to use land. But this relationship was rarely equal. Power rested heavily above them. Still, village life had its own systems. People cooperated because they had to. Harvests required many hands. Buildings needed repair. Animals wandered. Disputes had to be settled. Customs mattered. Local traditions shaped behaviour as much as written law. The law itself was not always distant and formal. It could be local, personal, and tied to custom. What people owed, what they could use, where animals could graze, who had rights to certain land, these things were often decided through layers of tradition. For modern eyes, this world can feel restrictive, and it was. But for the people living inside it, it was also familiar. It gave order. It told them where they belonged, what was expected, and how life should continue. Then there was night. Night 1,000 years ago was not simply the end of the day. It was a different world. Without electric light, darkness had weight. The village became quiet. Roads became uncertain. Forests seemed deeper. Sounds carried differently. The fire inside the home became more precious. People did not casually move through darkness the way we do now. Night invited caution. It also invited imagination. Stories of spirits, demons, saints, omens, strange creatures, and hidden dangers filled the spaces that people could not see. Folklore was not just entertainment. It was a way to explain the unknown. The forest, especially, held meaning. It provided wood, food, hunting, herbs, and pasture. But it also represented danger, mystery, and the edge of human control. Beyond cleared fields and village paths, the world felt less predictable. Weather could change everything. A storm could damage crops. A late frost could ruin hope. Too much rain could rot harvests. Too little could dry the land. People watched the sky with seriousness because the sky was not background. It was destiny. And yet, despite the difficulty, communities endured. They adapted. They built rhythms around uncertainty. They saved what they could. They trusted memory. They relied on neighbours. They prayed when they had no control. And slowly, year after year, life continued. The world of 1,000 years ago was not primitive in the sense of being empty or simple-minded. It was rich with skill, belief, structure, fear, beauty, and struggle. It was a world where people knew the land more intimately than many of us ever will, where the changing of seasons was not decoration, but survival, where a loaf of bread carried the labour of fields, weather, hands, fire, and time, where a village bell could shape the day, where the past was remembered through voices, where darkness was real, and where ordinary people, whose names were never written in books, carried history forward without knowing it. Because history is not only made by rulers, it is made by the people who wake before sunrise, who plant, who build, who endure, who raise children in uncertain times, who gather round firelight when the world outside disappears into night. 1,000 years ago, life was smaller in distance, but deeper in dependence, harder in body, but deeply connected to land and community. And as we continue this journey, we begin to see that the medieval world was not simply a dark age. It was a human world, fragile, religious, difficult, alive, and for millions of people, It was the only world they ever knew. Beyond the small villages and quiet fields, the world 1,000 years ago was held together by something fragile. Obligation. Not freedom in the modern sense, not governments with clear borders and systems people could easily understand, but layers of loyalty, land, protection, service, fear, faith, and survival. A person did not simply live in a place. They belonged to it. The land shaped identity. The Lord shaped duty. The church shaped belief. And the community shaped reputation. To modernize, this can feel almost impossible to imagine. Today, people move cities, change work, speak across oceans, and build lives far from where they were born. But around the year 1000, most people lived inside a much smaller world, a world where distance was heavy, a world where a forest, a river, a mountain, or even a muddy road could separate one life from another. And above all of it stood power, not always visible every day, but always present. In the distance, on a hill or near a strategic road, there might be a fortified residence. Early castles were not always the enormous stone fortresses we imagine from later centuries. Many began as simpler wooden defences, raised earthworks, towers, and enclosed spaces meant to protect people, control land, and show authority. A castle was not just a building. It was a message. It said that someone ruled here, someone collected dues here, someone had soldiers, weapons, land, and influence. For ordinary people, the castle could mean protection, but also pressure. It could shelter a community during danger, but it also reminded everyone who held power. The lord who controlled the land had responsibilities, but those responsibilities were unequal. He might offer military protection, settle disputes, and maintain order. In return, people owed labour, crops, rent, or loyalty. This system was not the same everywhere. Medieval Europe was not one single world with one single structure. Customs changed from region to region. Some peasants had more rights than others. Some were more restricted. Some towns had growing freedoms. Some rural communities were tightly controlled. But everywhere, power was personal. You did not deal with a distant state as much as you dealt with local authority, a lord, a bishop, a village elder, a monastery, a noble family, a court that followed custom more than written rules. Life was organized through relationships. Who owed what to whom, who had the right to use certain land, who could collect payment, who could judge a dispute, who could call men to defend a territory. These questions shaped the medieval world as much as any king did. Kings existed, of course, but 1,000 years ago, many kings did not have the direct control that later rulers would dream of. Their authority often depended on alliances, noble families, military loyalty, and the church. A king could be powerful in name, but weak in reach. Messages moved slowly. Orders could take days or weeks to arrive. A distant noble might obey, or hesitate, or ignore the command if the king was too far away to enforce it. This made the world feel fragmented. A map may show kingdoms, but real power often lived locally. And this is why loyalty mattered so much. Oaths were serious. Promises were political. A noble might swear loyalty to a greater lord, receive land or protection, and, in return, offer military service. These bonds created networks of power. But networks can break. A disagreement over inheritance, land, marriage, tribute, or honor could create conflict. Alliances could shift. Families could rise or fall. A person's entire future could depend on decisions made by people they had never met. For ordinary villagers, these conflicts were distant and close at the same time. Distant because they were decided by powerful people. Close because the consequences reached the fields. A war between nobles could mean extra demands, damaged crops, unsafe roads, or the arrival of armed men near home. Even when battles were far away, the cost of conflict could travel quietly into daily life. And yet, the medieval world was not only ruled by fear, it was also held together by exchange. Markets were vital. A village could produce much of what it needed, but not everything. Salt, iron tools, better cloth, pottery, wine, spices, dyes, wax, and other goods often came through trade. Some items were common in one region and rare in another. This made movement valuable. Markets brought people together. They were places of noise, colour, smell, bargaining, and news. A person might come to sell grain, eggs, wool, animals, tools, or handmade objects. Others came to buy what they could not make themselves. The market was also a window into the wider world. A trader might speak of a distant town. A pilgrim might mention a holy site. A messenger might carry political news. In a time when written communication was limited for most people, public spaces became living networks of information. Towns were growing in importance. They were not yet the massive urban centres of later centuries, but they offered something different from the village: specialisation. In towns, people could become bakers, blacksmiths, leather workers, carpenters, masons, brewers, weavers, merchants, scribes, or servants in larger households. Work could be divided more carefully. Skills could be passed through apprenticeship. A young person sent to learn a craft might live with a master, work long hours, and gradually gain knowledge. This could be difficult, but it also offered a path different from farming. Craft was identity. To make shoes, shape metal, carve wood, build with stone, copy manuscripts, or prepare cloth was to hold a skill that others depended on. Every object took time. A simple knife, a pair of shoes, a wooden bowl, a wool garment, a door hinge, all carried human labour. Nothing was instant. Nothing appeared from a factory far away. The world was made by hands. This made material things more meaningful. Clothing was repaired again and again. Tools were maintained carefully. Broken objects were not quickly replaced. A household chest, a cooking pot, or a cloak could remain valuable for years. Money existed, but daily exchange was not always simple. Coins circulated unevenly depending on region and situation. Payment could happen through goods, labour, rent, dues, or local arrangements. Wealth was often tied to land, animals, stored grain, tools, and rights. The economy was physical. You could see it in barns, in fields, in workshops, in animals, in the strength of a harvest, in the number of hands available to work. Travel was possible, but not casual. People travelled for trade, pilgrimage, work, marriage, military service, religious duty, or necessity. But every journey required thought. Roads could be rough, weather could delay movement, bridges were not always reliable, rivers could be helpful or dangerous depending on season. A journey that seems short today could feel long then. A town a few days away might be the farthest place someone ever visited. A city might feel overwhelming. A port might seem like the edge of the known world. And yet, people did move. Merchants carried goods across regions. Pilgrims walked to sacred places. Monks travelled between religious houses. Soldiers marched when called. Messengers carried letters for the powerful. Movement connected the medieval world slowly, but steadily. Monasteries were among the most important centres of this world. They were not only religious communities, they were places of learning, farming, writing, storage, prayer, discipline, and organisation. In many regions, monasteries preserved knowledge, copied books, managed land, offered charity, and served as spiritual anchors. The sound of monastic life was different from village life, bells marking prayer, footsteps in stone corridors, voices chanting in low tones, pens moving across parchment. For monks, time was structured by devotion. The day was divided by prayer, work, reading, silence, and ritual. This rhythm created a different kind of order from the fields outside. Books were precious. A manuscript could take months or even years to produce. Parchment had to be prepared, ink mixed, letters carefully written, decorations added by skilled hands. A book was not just information, it was an object of labour and reverence. This meant knowledge moved slowly. But slowly does not mean weak. Ideas survived because people protected them. Religious texts, classical writings, legal documents, medical ideas, histories, and records passed through these careful hands. Without such communities, much of the past might have disappeared. The church also influenced politics. Kings sought legitimacy through religion. Rulers supported churches and monasteries. Bishops could hold major power. Religious authority and political authority often stood close together, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. For ordinary people, this connection shaped how they understood the world. Power was not only military, it was spiritual. To rule was not just to command bodies, but to claim moral order. A king or lord wanted people to believe that the structure of society had meaning beyond human arrangement. This gave the medieval world a deep sense of hierarchy. Heaven above, kings and nobles below, clergy guiding souls, workers sustaining life. Whether people accepted this fully, questioned it quietly, or simply endured it, it shaped the language of the age. But beneath the official order, human life remained complicated. People argued, people negotiated, people resisted when pushed too far. A peasant community was not powerless in every situation. Local customs could protect certain rights. Collective action mattered. A lord who demanded too much could create instability. Villagers knew the land, the labor, the seasons, and the practical limits of survival. Power had to be enforced, but it also had to be managed. This balance was delicate. Too little authority could bring disorder. Too much pressure could bring resentment. The medieval world survived through constant adjustment. Marriage was also part of this system. For many families, marriage was not only romance, it was alliance, labor, property, inheritance, and survival. A household needed workers. Families needed continuity. Land and goods had to pass from one generation to another. Among nobles, marriage could be political. A union between families could strengthen claims, settle conflict, or expand influence. A daughter or son might become part of a strategy larger than personal desire. Among ordinary people, marriage still carried practical weight. It shaped households, responsibilities, and community ties. Family was not just emotional. It was economic. Everyone contributed if they could. Old people carried memory and experience. Adults carried labor. Children learned roles early. The household was a working unit, not just a private space. But life remained uncertain. A good year could bring relief. A bad year could create anxiety. A strong ruler could bring stability. A weak one could invite conflict. A safe road could help trade. A dangerous road could isolate a community. People lived close to uncertainty in a way we rarely feel today. They could not check forecasts. They could not call for emergency help. They could not rely on modern medicine, transport, communication, or storage systems. Their security came from preparation, community, faith, and experience. Still, they built. This is one of the most important things to remember. Even in a difficult world, people did not only survive, they created. They carved doors, decorated churches, raised towers, made music, held festivals, told stories, designed tools, improved fields, organized markets, built roads, bridges, mills, and walls. They imagined futures, even if those futures were smaller than ours. They saved for children. They honored the dead. They celebrated harvests. They feared judgment. They hoped for mercy. The world 1,000 years ago was not empty darkness. It was a world of limits, but also of meaning. Every village belonged to a wider network. Every market connected distant lives. Every monastery preserved something fragile. Every castle reminded people of power. Every road carried risk and possibility. And every person lived inside a web of duties that shaped their days from birth to death. To live, then, was to know your place, but also to feel the weight of that place. It was to understand that the world above you was powerful, that the land beneath you was necessary, that the people around you were part of your survival, and that beyond the horizon there were other towns, other rulers, other dangers, and other stories. 1,000 years ago, life was not only about how people ate, worked, and slept. It was about how they belonged to land, to lord, to church, to family, to custom, to a world that seemed fixed, yet was slowly changing beneath their feet. Because even then, history was moving, towns were growing, trade was expanding, castles were rising, power was shifting. And the medieval world, quiet as it may seem from a distance, was already preparing for centuries of transformation. 1,000 years ago, the human body lived much closer to the edge, not because people were weak, but because the world around them offered very little protection. A small injury could become serious. A fever could change the future of a family. A difficult winter could weaken an entire village, and an illness that seemed ordinary at first could become something no one knew how to stop. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no antibiotics, no quick diagnosis, no machines to look inside the body. Medicine existed, but it lived in a different world of ideas. People understood health through a mixture of observation, tradition, religion, inherited knowledge, and theories passed down from ancient writers. They watched the body carefully. They noticed heat, cold, pain, weakness, colour, breath, appetite, sleep, and behaviour. But they did not understand disease the way we do today. Invisible causes were often explained through imbalance, bad air, divine punishment, curses, fate, or spiritual danger. The boundary between medicine and belief was not clear. To heal the body could also mean to protect the soul. A sick person might receive herbs. They might be given rest. They might be prayed over. They might be taken to a holy place. They might be treated by a local healer, a monk, a wise woman, a barber surgeon, or someone known in the community for experience with wounds, plants, and remedies. Some treatments helped. Some did nothing. Some made things worse. But people did what they could, because doing nothing was impossible when someone you loved was suffering. Herbs were important. Plants were gathered, dried, mixed, boiled, crushed, or placed into simple remedies. Knowledge of plants could be passed through families, monasteries, and local tradition. A person who knew which leaves eased pain, which roots calmed the stomach, which mixtures help with sleep, or which plants should never be touched, held valuable knowledge. This knowledge was not modern science, but it was not meaningless. It came from generations of watching nature closely. The medieval world forced people to observe. They observed animals, weather, soil, bodies, seasons, the smell of water, the colour of plants, the sound of breathing. Life trained them to notice details that many people today would miss. Still, danger was everywhere. Childbirth was dangerous. Infancy was fragile. Wounds were risky. Tooth pain could become severe. Bad water could bring sickness. Crowded towns could spread illness quickly. And when disease entered a community, fear moved with it. People did not always know how illness travelled. They might avoid certain smells, certain places, certain people, or certain signs they believed were connected to sickness. Sometimes they isolated the ill, sometimes they turned to prayer, sometimes they searched for someone to blame. Fear can make people compassionate, but it can also make them cruel. In times of crisis, suspicion could spread as quickly as disease itself. Strangers were watched, outsiders were feared. Unusual behaviour could be judged harshly. A person who lived differently, who practiced unfamiliar customs, or who stood outside the ordinary rhythm of the community could become a target of anxiety. This is one of the darker truths of the medieval world. When people lacked explanations, they often created them, and those explanations could shape lives. The world 1,000 years ago was filled with signs. A comet in the sky, a sudden storm, a failed harvest, a strange illness, a dream, an animal acting unusually. To us, many of these things may seem natural, but to many people then, The world was alive with messages. Events were not always random. They could be warnings, judgments, omens, tests. This made life meaningful, but also frightening, because if the world was full of signs, then every disaster might mean something. Every failure might demand explanation. Every misfortune might feel personal. Religion offered comfort, but it also shaped fear. People believed deeply in the reality of the soul, heaven, sin, judgment, saints, miracles, and spiritual danger. Death was not seen as the end in the way many modern people imagine it. It was a passage into something greater, and that made the preparation for death extremely important. Confession, prayer, ritual, blessings, burial, memory. These things mattered. A person wanted to die in a state of grace. Families wanted the dead to be treated properly. Communities remembered those who passed, not only emotionally but spiritually. The living and the dead remained connected through prayer and ritual. This changed the way people lived. The church calendar did not only organize time, it gave meaning to time. There were holy days, fasting days, feast days, saints' days, seasons of repentance, moments of celebration, and periods of solemn reflection. The year was not just agricultural, it was spiritual. Even fear had a rhythm, even hope had a date, but faith did not remove suffering. It gave people a way to carry it. When illness came, when children died young, when crops failed, when violence approached, people turned to the explanations they had. They asked what God wanted. They asked what sin had caused. They asked which saint might intercede. They made promises. They gave offerings if they could. They walked to shrines. They touched relics. They listened to sermons. To the modern mind, this may seem distant, but for them, it was real. The spiritual world was not a metaphor. It was part of daily existence. And because of that, sacred places held enormous power. A church was not simply a building. It was a place where the ordinary world touched the eternal. The altar, the candles, the painted images, the smell of incense, the sound of chant, all of it created an atmosphere that reminded people they were part of something beyond themselves. For many, beauty was found there. Even in a hard life, people could enter a church and see colour, light, carvings, images of saints, scenes from scripture, and objects more carefully made than almost anything in their homes. Art taught those who could not read. A painted wall could tell a story. A carved figure could express warning. A stained surface could transform sunlight into something almost heavenly. The medieval world was not visually empty. It had beauty, but much of that beauty was tied to faith, power, and community. Outside sacred spaces, justice was another force shaping life. Law 1,000 years ago was not the same everywhere. It depended on region, custom, lordship, church authority, royal power, and local tradition. But justice was often public, personal, and deeply connected to reputation. A dispute over land, animals, debt, insult, marriage, inheritance, or violence could involve the community. Witnesses mattered. Oaths mattered. To swear something falsely was not just a legal problem, it was a spiritual danger. Because words carried weight, promises were not casual. An oath could bind a person before God and community. Breaking it could damage the soul, the family, and the reputation of everyone connected to the person. Punishment existed, but it was not always about prison. Prisons were not commonly used the way modern societies use them. Many punishments focused on fines, public shame, compensation, loss of rights, exile, or physical penalties. Justice could be harsh, especially by modern standards, but it was also shaped by status. A noble and a peasant might not be treated the same. Power influenced outcomes. Connections influenced outcomes. The idea that all people stood equally before the law was not yet a reality. But communities still needed order. They needed ways to settle conflict. If someone stole, lied, damaged property, or broke custom, it affected everyone. In a small world where survival depended on cooperation, trust mattered deeply. A dishonest neighbour was not simply annoying. They could become dangerous to the balance of daily life. This is why reputation was so important. A person's name was a form of currency. To be known as reliable, honest, hard-working, respectful, and faithful could protect someone. To be known as suspicious, lazy, violent, or dishonest could isolate them. In a small community, people remembered, and being remembered badly could follow a person for years. Honour also mattered. Among nobles, honour could be tied to lineage, loyalty, courage, generosity, and public behaviour. Among ordinary people, honour was different, but still real. It could be tied to family, work, faith, and how one behaved before neighbours. Public life carried pressure. You were seen. You were judged. And your actions became part of the story people told about you. Then there was fear of violence. Not constant everywhere, not every day, but always possible. A raid, a feud, a dispute between lords, a band of armed men, a conflict over land, or instability after a ruler's death could bring danger. The medieval world did not have modern policing. Protection depended on local power, walls, community, weapons, and warning. People learned to live with uncertainty. They listened for news. They watched roads. They knew where to go if danger approached. Some places had fortified churches, towers, enclosed settlements, or nearby castles. These were not only symbols, they could become places of refuge when the outside world became unsafe. But violence was not the only threat. Fire was terrifying. Most buildings used wood, thatch, straw, cloth, and open flame. A small mistake could destroy a home. In crowded places, fire could spread quickly. People understood the danger because they lived beside it every day. The hearth gave life. But it could also take everything. This is one of the strange balances of medieval life. The same things that protected people could threaten them. Fire warmed and burned. Water sustained and carried sickness. Animals fed and injured. Forests supplied and hid danger. Walls protected and trapped. Community supported and judged. Faith comforted and frightened. Life was never one thing. It was always a mixture, and because of that, people developed a deep acceptance of uncertainty. Not in a passive way, but in a practical way. They planned when they could. They stored what they could. They prayed when planning was not enough. They relied on others when one household could not manage alone. They lived with the understanding that control was limited. This shaped their minds. A modern person may believe the future can be organized through schedules, savings, insurance, medicine, communication, and technology. A medieval person knew that much of life remained outside human control. A storm could undo months of work. A sickness could change a family. A lord's decision could alter a village. A war could arrive without warning. A bad harvest could bring hunger. And yet, people continued. They did not see themselves as living in the Middle Ages. They were not waiting to become modern. They lived fully inside their own present. They loved their children. They worried about tomorrow. They laughed at jokes. They grew tired after long days. They enjoyed warm food. They feared shame. They wanted safety. They honoured traditions. They remembered the dead. They watched the sky. They hoped for mercy. And in this way, their world becomes easier to understand, not because it was like ours, but because the people inside it were human. They lived with different tools, different beliefs, different dangers, and different limits. But the emotional core was familiar. Fear of loss, hope for protection, desire for belonging, need for meaning, trust in community, concern for family, a longing to survive another season. 1,000 years ago, life was shaped by fragility. The body was fragile, the home was fragile, the harvest was fragile, peace was fragile. But fragility did not make life empty. It made every stable moment valuable. A calm evening mattered. A healthy child mattered. A successful harvest mattered. A repaired roof mattered. A warm fire mattered. A prayer answered, or believed to be answered, mattered. This world was not only dark, It was intense. Because when survival is uncertain, ordinary things become powerful. Bread is not just food, it is relief. Light is not just brightness, it is safety. A bell is not just sound, it is order. A familiar face is not just company, it is protection. And perhaps that is what makes life 1,000 years ago so difficult to imagine and so moving to explore. They lived with less control than we do, but they noticed dependence more clearly. They understood that life was held together by fragile things: body, land, faith, community, memory. And every day, they stepped into a world where none of those things could be taken for granted. 1,000 years ago, the world did not only look different, it felt different, it sounded different, it smelled different, it moved at a different speed. To enter that world, we have to imagine life before modern noise, before engines, before electric light, before screens, before the constant hum that now surrounds almost every hour of the day. Silence existed more deeply then, but it was never empty. In the countryside, mornings could begin with animals, wind, footsteps, tools, distant bells, and the soft movement of people already working before the day had fully opened. In a town, the soundscape was sharper. Cart wheels over rough ground, hammer strikes from a blacksmith, voices bargaining in the market, animals being led through narrow streets, doors opening, water carried, children calling, church bells cutting through everything, reminding people of time, prayer, duty, and community. The medieval world was full of sound, but not constant mechanical sound. Most noises came from living things: human hands, animals, weather, fire, stone, wood. And because there was less background noise, every sound carried meaning. A bell could mean prayer. A horn could mean warning. A shout in the street could draw attention. A horse arriving quickly could bring news. A storm in the distance could make people stop and look at the sky. Sound was information. And people listened carefully. Light was just as important. Today, we press a switch and the room changes instantly. But 1,000 years ago, light had to be earned. It came from the sun, the moon, fire, candles, oil lamps, and glowing embers. Daylight controlled life. A bright day allowed work, travel, building, washing, repairing, gathering, trading, and movement. A dark day slowed everything. Winter shortened the useful hours. Clouds could make interiors dim. Smoke could fill rooms and blur the air. Windows were not like modern glass windows in most ordinary homes. Many houses had small openings, shutters, or simple coverings. Light entered unevenly. Interiors could feel shadowed even during the day. This changed how people saw the world. The glow of flame made faces move. Shadows stretched across walls. A candle could make a small room feel alive, but also fragile. People knew the value of a flame because darkness was real. Night was not just a background, it was a boundary. In towns, some streets might have occasional lights, but nothing close to modern brightness. In villages, once the fire faded and the door closed, the outside world became something uncertain. The moon mattered, the stars mattered. A clear night could guide movement. A moonless night could feel heavy and endless, and the sky itself was more visible than it is for many people today. Without city lights filling the air, stars could appear with incredible clarity. The night sky was not decoration. It was part of life, part of direction, part of imagination, and part of belief. People looked upward and saw order, mystery, warning, beauty. They did not separate the sky from daily life the way modern people often do. The heavens were connected to meaning, seasons, and divine design. The smell of the medieval world was also different. Smoke was everywhere. Wood fires burned in homes, workshops, kitchens, and outdoor spaces. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, hair, walls, food, and streets. It was not unusual. It was part of the atmosphere of life. There were also smells of animals. wet earth, leather, wool, grain, fresh bread, sweat, herbs, iron, river water, mud, and waste. A town could be intense. Narrow streets, crowded living spaces, workshops, markets, animals, and poor drainage created a world of strong smells. People were used to this in ways we are not. Their senses adapted to a reality where cleanliness existed, but not in a modern sanitized form. That does not mean people did not care about washing. They did, but hygiene was shaped by access, custom, class, climate, and belief. People washed hands, faces, clothing, tools, and household items when possible. In some places, bathhouses existed. In others, washing was more limited. Clean linen could matter, smell could matter, appearance could matter. But the medieval idea of clean was not the same as ours. It was practical. It was social. It was moral at times. And it depended heavily on what a person could afford. Clothing revealed status almost immediately. Before someone spoke, their clothes could tell others something about their place in the world. The fabric, colour, quality, cut, decoration, and condition of clothing all mattered. Most ordinary people wore practical garments made from materials like wool and linen. Clothing had to endure work, weather, and repeated repair. A piece of clothing was not casual. It represented labour, from growing or gathering fibres, spinning thread, weaving fabric, cutting, sewing, dyeing, and maintaining it. Every garment carried time. The poor had fewer clothes, the wealthy had more choices. Nobles could display power through richer fabrics, brighter colours, embroidery, fur, belts, jewellery, and carefully made accessories. Clothing was not only protection from cold, it was identity. To dress above your rank could be seen as improper in many societies. The way people appeared in public was tied to order. Everyone was expected to understand their place, and clothing helped make that order visible. Shoes mattered too. A good pair of shoes could protect feet from cold, stones, mud, and injury. But shoes wore out. They needed repair. Some people went barefoot at times, especially in poor conditions or certain work settings. For modern people, shoes are ordinary. For many in the past, they were valuable. Hands roughened by work, faces darkened by sun, posture shaped by carrying, bending, lifting, walking and repeating the same tasks year after year. There were no modern comforts to protect the body from constant use. Furniture was simple, beds varied widely, heating was limited, work was physical, weather entered life more directly. Cold was one of the great realities. In winter, keeping warm required effort. Firewood had to be collected or purchased. Clothing had to be layered. Homes had to be closed against wind. People shared spaces. Animals could add warmth in certain household arrangements. Sleep could be shaped by cold as much as by tiredness. Heat had its own difficulties. Summer meant labour under the sun, insects, spoiled food, thirst, and the pressure of harvest. The seasons did not simply change scenery, they changed the body's experience of living. Time itself felt different. Mechanical clocks were not yet part of ordinary life in the way they would later become. People did not divide the day into exact minutes and seconds, as we do now. They lived by natural time: sunrise, midday, sunset, bells, meals, work rhythms, prayer hours, market days, holy days, seasons. The year was not a blank calendar filled with appointments. It was a circle of repeated moments: planting, growth, harvest, slaughtering, fasting, feasting, cold, thaw, rain, drought, festivals, and saints' days. People remembered time through events: the year of the bad harvest, the winter when the river froze, the summer when sickness came, the feast when a marriage was celebrated, the day a traveller brought news, the season when a lord changed. Memory tied time to experience. This made life feel slower in some ways, but not empty. A slow world can still be intense when every task matters. Even communication had a different weight. Words had to travel by mouth, messenger, letter, song. sermon, rumour or public announcement. News did not arrive instantly. A major event could take weeks or months to become known in another region. And by the time news arrived, it could already be changed. A story passed from traveller to merchant, from merchant to priest, from priest to villagers, could grow, shrink, or transform. Details blurred, fear added colour, hope added meaning. Suspicion changed interpretation. This meant rumour was powerful. A rumour could frighten a village, damage a reputation, raise expectations, start movement, or prepare people for danger. In a world where certainty was rare, people relied on trust. Who said it? Where did they come from? Did others hear the same thing? Was the story believable? Did it match what people already feared? Information was not only about facts, it was about relationships. Language also shaped identity. Europe 1,000 years ago was full of spoken languages, dialects, local accents, and regional speech. A traveller moving through different areas could find that words changed, customs changed, and even familiar things carried unfamiliar names. Latin held a special place in the church, law, learning, and official writing. But ordinary people often lived in local languages. The world of speech and the world of writing were not the same. For many, spoken words were the true home of memory. Stories were told aloud, songs carried history, proverbs taught behaviour, legends explained places. Family memories passed through generations without ever being written down. This made voice powerful. A good storyteller could hold a room. A singer could preserve events. A preacher could shape fear and hope. A public reading could bring written words to those who could not read them. To listen was a major part of learning, and entertainment often grew from shared presence. People gathered for seasonal celebrations, weddings, feast days, markets, religious festivals, and local traditions. There could be music, dancing, storytelling, games, contests, food, drink, and laughter. These moments mattered because life was hard. Celebration was not a luxury. It was release, a village feast, a wedding meal, a festival day, or a market gathering allowed people to step outside ordinary labour for a short time. It strengthened community. It reminded people that survival was not the only human need. People needed joy. Even in a difficult world, they created it. Music could come from simple instruments, voices, rhythms, and memory. Dancing did not require a stage. Games did not require modern equipment. Children played with whatever was available. Sticks, stones, handmade toys, animals, spaces between buildings, imagination. The medieval world had laughter. It had humour. It had teasing, gossip, songs, local characters, embarrassing stories, and moments of warmth that never entered official records. This is important because written history often preserves the serious side of life: law, war, taxes, religion, kings, disasters. But ordinary life also had small pleasures: a good meal after hunger, a warm fire after rain, a successful repair, a safe return from travel, a child's first steps, a joke told at the right moment, a song remembered by everyone. These things do not always survive in documents, but they made life livable. The natural world was closer to. Animals were not hidden away from daily experience. They moved through roads, yards, fields, markets, and homes. People understood animal sounds and behaviour because they depended on them. A cow was wealth. A horse was power and movement. A pig was food and trouble. A dog could guard. Chickens gave eggs. Oxen pulled. Sheep gave wool. Animals were not pets in the modern sentimental sense for most people. Though bonds certainly existed, they were part of survival, labour, and economy. The line between human settlement and wilderness was also thinner. Forests, marshes, hills, rivers, and open land were not distant recreational spaces. They were sources of fuel, food, danger, mystery, and opportunity. People gathered berries, nuts, herbs, wood, reeds, mushrooms, and materials. They hunted where allowed. They avoided places considered unsafe. They told stories about certain paths, certain trees, certain waters, certain ruins. Landscape had memory. A hill might be connected to a battle, a spring to a saint, a tree to a warning, a road to danger, a field to inheritance. Place was not empty. It held meaning. This made the world feel alive in a way that is difficult to recreate now. Every part of the landscape could be named, remembered, feared, used, or blessed. And because people rarely travelled far, the familiar world became deep. A modern person may know many places lightly. A medieval villager might know one place intensely. Where the ground stayed wet, where the path became dangerous after rain, where the best wood could be found where animals strayed, where the sun reached first in spring, where frost lasted longest, where someone had died, where someone had made a promise. To live in one place for a lifetime was not necessarily to live without knowledge. It was to know differently, to know through repetition, through feet, through hands, through weather, through stories, through need. This is one of the deepest differences between then and now. Modern life often expands outward. Medieval life often deepened inward. The world may have been smaller for many people, but within that smaller world, every detail mattered. A tool was not just a tool. A road was not just a road. A bell was not just a sound. A fire was not just warmth. A garment was not just clothing. Everything carried use, meaning, effort, and memory. And when we imagine life 1,000 years ago, we should not imagine people moving through a dull or empty world. We should imagine a world dense with sensation. Smoke in the air, mud underfoot, wool against skin, bells in the distance, stars overhead, firelight on faces, voices in the dark, the smell of bread, the comfort of familiar paths, the pressure of being known by everyone around you. It was a world without many of the protections we now rely on. But it was not without texture, not without beauty, not without meaning. To live then was to be surrounded by limits, but also by immediacy. The day was close, the season was close, other people were close, and life itself, with all its hardship and tenderness, was felt directly. 1,000 years ago, people did not watch the world through glass and screens. They touched it. They carried it. They smelled it. They feared it. They listened to it. And every day, whether in a village, a town, a monastery, or a castle shadow, they moved through a world that was rough, fragile, and deeply alive. In the end, life 1,000 years ago was not just a story of castles, kings, villages, and churches. It was a story of ordinary people living through days that felt normal to them, but distant and almost unreal to us now. They woke before sunrise. They watched the sky for signs of rain. They feared winter, sickness, hunger, and war. They lived in homes filled with smoke and candlelight, walked on muddy roads, and measured time by bells, seasons, and prayer. Their world was smaller than ours, but it was not empty. It was full of meaning. Every harvest mattered. Every loaf of bread carried effort. Every warm fire felt like safety. Every familiar face in the village was part of survival. They did not have the comfort, medicine, technology, or freedom that many people have today. But they understood something deeply, that life depended on others, on family, on neighbours, on the land, on faith, on memory. A person could not live completely alone in that world. To survive meant to belong to a household, to a village, to a church, to a rhythm older than any one life. And even though their days were hard, they still found moments of beauty, a wedding feast, a song beside the fire, the first warmth of spring, fresh bread after long labour, a safe return from a dangerous road, a quiet evening when nothing went wrong. These small moments were not small to them. They were life itself. Most of their names were never written down. Their homes disappeared. Their tools broke. Their voices faded, but their lives still matter, because the world we know was built on the world they endured. They were not simply people from the past. They were mothers, fathers, children, workers, believers, dreamers, and survivors. They looked at their own time and did not know it would one day become history. They did not know that centuries later, we would try to imagine their homes, their fears, their clothes, their food, their nights, and their hopes. They simply lived, day after day, season after season, year after year. And maybe that is the most powerful truth of all. History is not only made by great rulers or famous battles, it is also made by quiet lives, by people who wake up, work, love, suffer, pray, and continue. So when we ask what life was really like 1,000 years ago, the answer is not simple. It was difficult. It was fragile. It was dark. It was beautiful. It was human. And somewhere, in a small village at dusk, smoke rises from wooden rooftops. A bell sounds in the distance. The fields grow silent. Families return home. The fire is lit. Night falls. And history keeps moving.